So I think we're going to start, and it would be great if you will turn your phones off, please. I'm Marcia Reed. I'm one of the curators of artists and their books, the exhibition that is at the Getty Research Institute through the end of October. And this is almost the last of our series and events. In mid-October, we're also going to have a screening of Felicia Rice on her book, Doc on Doc, that's a PBS film. And so I think it's October 13th, but there will be publicity on that as well. Tonight, we have one of my favorite publishers and artists talking about one of my favorite books that's inspired by one of my favorite 18th century books. So this is sort of a nice trifecta. It's Diderot project. Ken Botnick has been printing and publishing limited editions for more than 35 years. First as proprietor of Red Osier Press. I didn't know what a red osier was. It's a tree, a plant, a tree, in New York. And today he publishes under the imprint M- in St. Louis. But I think that's going to change because you're moving to Massachusetts, right? Very soon. Is a professor of art at Washington University in St. Louis, where he directs the Kranzberg Book Studio, and he teaches courses in publication design. He was the recipient of a Fulbright Teaching Fellowship in 2006 to support his residency in India at the National Institute of Design at Ahmedabad, and as well as led workshops in the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay and at the Srishti School of Art and Design in Bangalore. So he is integrating other traditions of reading and making books. Ken's book, Kamini, Selections from the Gita Govinda, published in Sanskrit and English, was selected by the AIGA, the American Institute of Graphic Arts, for its 50 Books, 50 Covers 2007 annual jury show. And this book that he's talking about, the Diderot Project, won the Minnesota Center for Book Arts, which is one of the premier centers for book arts and bookmaking in the country. That was its biennial international competition for artist books in 2015. His work is found in eminent collections like ours at the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Bodleian, Newberry Library in Chicago, the Yale Artist Book Collection, and libraries at Smith, Harvard, Wellesley, and his archive is at the New York Public Library. So please welcome, and thank you very much, Ken, for coming. Please welcome Ken Botnick.
Thank you, Marcia. And this is one of my favorite auditoriums to speak in. I'm really happy to be here. While I'm speaking tonight about a single project of mine, my goal is larger, to stimulate thought about why the book remains such a durable, useful object in the 21st century. Of course, people love books. There's a great sentimental attachment to the object. But my investment in the book is as a maker and teacher who finds in it a tool for thinking about the world and a method of exploration. I also return to the book because it delights me, and delight feels in short supply these days. My talk will follow this organization. First, I'll discuss some terms that I wrestle with. Next, I'll place the Diderot project in the context of a larger world of research interests. Then I'll discuss a particular reading process of the plates of the Encyclopédie, Diderot's Encyclopédie. And finally, I'll talk about the method of creating this book. To begin, this notion of the artist's book. I don't love this term. For a long time, I tried not to use it to describe my work because I don't think of myself as an artist. I'm more a designer, printer, publisher. Also not a great and easy way to describe oneself. So over time, I've relented, and for lack of a better one, now I use this term. When I began my career in the late 1970s, my intention was to become a papermaker and printer publisher in what was then called the fine press tradition. At that time, one could acquire the means of production, a letterpress, for next to nothing and go into business printing the works of even major poets. Steve Miller and I did just that at Red Osier Press in New York City for about 10 years. The intention was to publish great writing in beautifully printed editions with images by artists who were unaccustomed to working in the book form. Design was workmanlike, the intention being to remain somewhat invisible in the Beatrice Ward tradition of the crystal goblet. We knew the rudiments of typographic design, learning as we worked. At that time, the fine press world saw itself as apart from the artist book world, the dividing line being a degree of fineness. It was the democratic multiple versus the crafted object. Those two practices rarely overlapped in those days. But I admired the vitality of the books that were economically made. In the best work, there seemed to be thought exploding off those pages. The birth of our first daughter inspired me to consider what it might actually be like to make a bit of regular money in support of our growing family. I was hired improbably by Yale University Press to design and oversee production of the art books. I can say I really wasn't qualified to work at Yale Press. It was like an opportunity to learn the vast body of typographic and book design knowledge I didn't own. It was like going to graduate school. I have no formal graphic design education, and I don't say that proudly. My design training was in landscape design, but I learned every day on that job at Yale and made myself a student of design. I maintained my letterpress during our time in New Haven, but felt a need to do more with the letterpress approach than I had previously attempted, and that I no longer wanted to do books that were recognized merely for having been letterpress printed. They needed to do and reflect more of who I was as a designer craftsman, and there needed to be evidence of thought on that page. I wanted the presswork to feel as part of my design method, not just a way of printing it. I wanted to employ whatever mastery I'd gained in my craft to explore the larger world of design thinking I was experiencing in my work at Yale, a degree of authorship, let's say, over my projects. In the catalog for the current exhibition here, there are books made in a wide variety of ways, on the letterpress, Xeroxed multiple, drawn one-of-a-kind pieces, torn or altered pieces in some other fashion. Books made to be read and those made as sculpture. There are so many methods of making books that the term artist book is difficult to define. A uniting feature of the artist book, however, is in the approach to authorship. In artist book, the maker-author engages material, form, and production, all as ways of extending the authorial voice. That voice is no longer defined purely by words or pictures. The author's vocabulary has, in a very real and material sense, been expanded. Rather than thinking of a book as a mute vessel into which ideas and words are then poured, it is the form of the book itself that is a catalyst for the exploration of subject. It is through the making of the work that the true subject is revealed. I find the concept of transparency a little slippery. On the one hand, it refers to something that has a see-through, there, not there quality. But when applied to organizational life, in governments, for instance, it seems to imply something that is concrete, knowable, and even honest. For me, there is a bit of productive dissonance to this two-sided definition, and I try to use that tension as an element of my design method. The Encyclopédie was a call by Diderot and his empiricist philosophe partners for a more transparent, democratic, and secular society. Diderot's Encyclopedia project states its intention on the title page of each volume as an encyclopedia or reasoned dictionary of the sciences, arts, and métiers. Placing the métier, the crafts, equal to the arts was a statement that those who worked with their hands were equal to artists and philosophers, and reason, not religion or monarchy, was at the core of his project. By giving the workshop such prominence, Diderot contradicted the prevailing protectionist policies of the day, openly sharing the production processes that were the key to the riches of France, many of which were the property of the king or the guild. Diderot was, in fact, introducing the concept of open source to Enlightenment Europe. When making a graphic work, we search for a visual metaphor capable of expressing intention, and I found that metaphorical capacity in the material transparency of ink, paper, and watermarks. While my use of transparency was stimulated by Diderot's goal, this method began to have deeper resonance with other interests of mine, particularly with the way the book form mimics memory. The codex form determines the sequential path for the reader. Transparency allowed me to explore the layered complexity of several page surfaces combining to form a single image, an image that deepened with each page turn. I wanted a reading experience that asked the reader to participate in the construction of content, moving forward and back to dig more deeply into the meaning of these pages. We often hear contemporary culture characterized as being visual culture. And for those of us who teach, we're used to our students believing themselves to be highly visual creatures. I find this ironic given the degree to which earlier cultures depended on visual acuity in order to live in and learn about their world. While we as a culture are awash in images, where we are increasingly less capable of the interpretive and correlative discipline required to read those images or to make use of them. Later in my talk, I'll discuss the complex form of reading required to adequately make sense of the Encyclopédie plates. Annie Albers, in her book Writings on Design, refers to steps in the production of handmade objects as the traditions of operation, the repetitive tasks makers engage in that are generative because of their repetitive nature, not in spite of them. While essential to the overall process, they can be accomplished without our complete focus. By keeping our hands on the material, engaged in the operations, we find a surprising flow of energy and ideas. This lies at the very heart of the concept of making as thinking. David Brett, quoted in my book, writes in Rethinking Decoration, "The fundamental operations of the hand, either direct or as transformed and enlarged by tools and machinery of all kinds, are themselves creative of meaning, because each is the start of a chain of metaphors. The very thing university programs are conditioning out of our students, the repetitive craft traditions assumed to be boring and unimaginative, are in fact generative." Albers goes on to write of these traditions, "But always they provide a discipline which balances the hubris of creative ecstasy," meaning there is always an element of craft production that corrects us by virtue of the requirements of those traditions. One of my mantras is making the book to discover the subject. The genius of the craft tradition is in the amount we come to understand about the nature of what we do as we are doing it. Age and experience, in this rare instance, is actually an advantage. Experience allows me to go deeply into a project with a more improvisational approach, trusting that my design method need go only so far in the computer, with the rest to be explored in the press. This is an unusual and not always efficient system. Typically, a book designer will complete the design of the entire book before the book goes to press. With Diderot Project, I was after a less predictable and more spontaneous process, maybe something more like listening to John Coltrane. I was designing successive sections of the book while editioning the previous one. The result is that of 150 pages, no two are alike. I'd never designed a book like that and found a useful tension in exploring something I'd not done before, especially something so complex. I went to India for the first time in 2003 to teach a typography workshop at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, the flagship design institute in India. But I was immediately drawn to the streets and marketplaces. No matter what was being sold or how humble the situation, people made great effort dedicated to the arrangement and organization of their wares. I wondered what it was about humans that drives us to organize our world into patterns of similarity, of color, size, or use. And why, as in the case of this vegetable seller, do we sometimes choose contrast over similarity? I took thousands of photographs of these markets, mostly of the tools used in craft production. The subject at the time on everybody's syllabus at NID was design thinking, but I found this a kind of cold academic form of design thinking, not possessing the vitality of what was found in the streets of India. Because craft is still readily practiced in the smaller towns and villages of India, I began thinking and writing about the connection of craft practice to innovation and creativity under the rubric subtle technology. I've made 15 trips to India and co-authored 5 articles in peer-reviewed journals with Dr. Ira Raja of Delhi University, assessing modes of craft practice and cultural influence. Pattern and color. For a few years, I led a study program for WashU students in a tiny village in Andhra Pradesh, which deepened my appreciation of how ingrained pattern and form and color are to the Indian landscape. These white line drawings are called mugalu in Telugu and are made each day at dawn by the women and girls of the village. Though tied to a set of patterns keyed to a dot grid, there is a tremendous amount of improvisation involved. When asked why the women do it, the answer is that it is auspicious, a concept that is not routinely used in Western culture. I began to consider how pattern itself was significant and symbolic, as if preparing the ground for something else to occur. It's worth noting that with Mugalu, there is no attachment to the final product. It begins to be obscured by traffic as soon as they are finished. The image on the lower right is something I took in Rajasthan that is kind of out of character, but it's so beautiful I couldn't not use it. It's just a bunch of old saris that are used as a fence around a garden plot. And when the saris get used, and they work in the wind in a particular fashion. The visual landscape in Indian streets provided a different form of design thinking, a rich ground for the sign painter to exercise his craft and to push the word image and word as image at possibilities. These signs embraced a simultaneous reading that contrasted the dimensional with the flat, the simple with the elaborate, in complex constructions of a single frame. In the process of introducing a disfluency to the reading process, the painters were making their work memorable by requiring the viewer to participate in the unraveling of the puzzle of the message. In the upper right are 2 images. To the center is one that was a key image for me, finding it in this little village of Kaleda. And on the right, a corner is Gopi, the sign painter of that sign, who I convinced to paint subtle technology on a classic Indian metal trunk for all of 400 rupees. These are the 6 elements that form the basis of what I came to call subtle technology, the design thinking of the artisans in India. A second research interest during this period was in the dynamics of cognitive reading and visual information processing, an area that is woefully underrepresented in our typography curriculum. In my courses, I worked with my students to create a series of visual models to reinterpret the way these phenomena were portrayed in the scientific literature. I began looking closely at the reading process, at what happens in our brains as we read. I wanted to provoke my design students to investigate the process of reading because it might affect how they design for others, particularly those with physical and cognitive challenges. So how does this have any connection to Diderot? One day in the Special Collections Library at WashU, one of my students made a comment that sent me off on a project that would consume my next 5 years. It was good, she said, that the Encyclopédie was safely in the library because it would be kept away from people and preserved. I said, yes, that was one function of the library, but more importantly, the library holds the work for you to be able to access it and formulate your own response to it. And I realized at that moment that I had not done that process yet. That night, I resolved to make a book based upon my research into the Encyclopédie. I understood that the world didn't need another book about the Encyclopédie. There are entire shelves of libraries already devoted to this. I felt there was something in the plates, a way of using them with text that could yield something new. I needed to create a search method that was the result of my own method of looking, and that looking took place through the lens of my camera. I began my photographic survey of the plate volumes with no particular agenda toward an outcome. As I was doing in India, I let my camera lens be my guide. At the beginning, I was interested in creating a method of seeing that I could continually question. The Encyclopédie with over 3,000 plates promised to keep me busy for a while, and I needed time for the exploration. I began photographing the most familiar plates, those on anatomy and natural history, for instance. But I soon found myself concentrating on those plates, illustrating production processes. While working in this way, I seemed to be creating a book as a work of ekphrasis, the plates acting as my original stimulus. And maybe in some ways it was a form of détournement, a kind of a hacking of the Encyclopédie, a book not about the encyclopedia as much as issuing from it. I don't know how many of you noticed that beautiful beetle on the Baldassare piece outside, but that one predates this one by about 200 years. After each of my photo sessions, I cataloged my images in digital folders based upon content and style of image. I realized that I was looking more closely at those plates illustrating production processes and the tools required for that process. In fact, over half the plates of the Encyclopédie are about making things. This created a direct and surprising link to my work in India. Some of the plates even looked remarkably similar to my photographs of the Indian marketplaces. My folders filled with tremendous varieties of tools, but two tools stood out as being common to most processes: the hammer and the compass, or divider. These became touchstones for me. There are some significant elements to note about the plates of the métier, the artisans' workshops. Finished products are rarely shown. The emphasis is almost entirely on process. There are no captions. The figure numbers you see on these plates key to caption-like information elsewhere in the text, but usually that information yields only the name of the thing pictured and nothing about its size or material. The plates require a form of reading that is very different than we are currently conditioned to. The most complex element on the page, the vignette at the top, is also the smallest, as in this view of a tinsmith's workshop. We must read the plate by correlating from vignette to tools below to understand how that tool is used. Even its size must be understood through this process of correlation. The perspectival, illustrative narrative of the vignette forms a strong contrast to the whiteness of the schematic, diagrammatic information below. Diderot felt that this process of correlation would be a catalyst for innovation. Sequence plays a critical role in the Encyclopédie. The editors had to determine how many plates were required to adequately illustrate a process, and in what order they would be presented. They must have understood something about the interrelationship of sequence and memory, how one thing builds on another when considering the plate order. Some of the métier required multiple plates, while others required only one or two. This is the sequence on wig making, and it starts upper left, goes across, and then lower left across. The emphasis on sequential reading made a tremendous impression on me and directly influenced my own book project. Hands are everywhere in the Encyclopédie, always engaged in making. Roland Barthes, in his essay on the plates of the Encyclopedia, remarks that it is difficult to be free of a culture of the hand. Because we no longer approach the Encyclopédie with the intention of learning the trades pictured, we are now permitted a very different response to these images. For me, the hand plays a significant role in the Encyclopedia. portrayed as the sensing object that forms our world conception, a great humanizing, poetic element amidst the rational and empirical philosophy of the Enlightenment. My photographic survey had derived three major categories: the hand, the tool, and the senses. At that point, I realized I needed to hear Diderot's voice. It was time to look more deeply into the content of the Encyclopédie, to think about its structure. I began with the preliminary discourse to the Encyclopédie, written by Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, one of Diderot's fellow philosophers, and major contributor to the organizational concept of the Encyclopedia project, through his writing in the preliminary discourse, which amounts to a user's guide to the book. In the discourse, there is this magnificent piece of information design that shows the conceptual arrangement of the project's subjects under three prime categories: memory, reason, and imagination. My photographic search had yielded a structure that resonated with Diderot and d'Alembert's organizational method. I knew my subjects. I had a pretty good idea of the methods I wanted to employ as visual metaphor in design and printing, and the process of reading and memory are always present in my thinking. It felt as though Diderot and I were having a conversation through this project. I was attracted to several of his writings on craft and the senses, and felt they could be excerpted effectively in my book. But Diderot alone was insufficient. Something needed to bring this book into the 21st century. I found that by pairing him with contemporary writers, his work felt even more contemporary. He needed other voices to argue with, and those came from various authors I have felt important to my creative life, including Barthes, Foucault, Bachelard, Ponge, Gary Snyder, several neuroscientists, and many others. The pages were growing in complexity and were presenting some interesting challenges to design, but still felt lacking something. And that something was my own voice. For this book, I knew I had to transcend the invisibility I usually claim as designer and printer, and place myself more purposefully on the page. I had admired Paul Rand's books on design process, the way he composed his textual and visual essays for the two-page spread, and I thought this was a place to try that system out. The book begins with an introduction to the importance of patterns to the reading process and to the nature of transparency and sequence. We turn the page, and things change. Typography is at the core of what I do as a designer, and I am interested in the way typography at times separates from linguistic meaning and moves into the realm of visual pattern. Letters have symbolic value, and a reader's first impulse is to make them into a word. But when a word is broken into unfamiliar bits that do not relate to syllabic constructs, a slowing or disfluency takes place, possibly embedding the word more deeply in the reader's memory. There will be no more printed encyclopedias. I wanted something that repeated throughout the book as a reminder of the power of the idea of something in print, of constancy of information versus the slippery and mutable form we are growing accustomed to. We no longer go to the Encyclopédie for the information its first readers did. Actually, quite a bit of that information on its pages was out of date by the time of its publication. But because of its presence in print, because of its signature of authorship, we can gain insights into its maker and the culture of their time. These typographic iterations of the word encyclopedia became a visual mantra that repeats throughout the book at moments of a change in subject, intended as a meditation on the nature of this subject, the book of the world. A 6-page sequence appears early in the book, stretching Diderot's name out over 4 pages, so at times one is reading through 4 printed surfaces, a metaphor for the complexity I found in Diderot's writing and personality. I wanted a typography robust enough to confront the complexity of the plates and create a visual tension between the plates and the type. This is also a clue to the reader that there will be a lot of moving forward and backward in this reading process. The opening 10-page sequence begins with the Encyclopedia mantra. Then the page turn reveals a kind of pulling apart of the pages, referencing the way the plates offset across the page now in the original volumes, the oil stain from the ink. There are 3 pages that act as a table of contents for the 3 main sections of the book. The large brackets referencing Diderot's original system of human knowledge diagram, but these having been drawn by my type designer studio mate, Ben Keel. The 3rd section of the contents is an indication of the half title of the book, this time requiring the page turn to be completed. My design process simultaneously engaged 3 or more layers of printed surface, activated and changed by each page turn. It was papermaking that brought me to making books, but it had been quite a long time since I'd been able to use handmade paper in a book of mine. In the early 1980s, I'd made a lot of paper at Dieudonné paper mill in New York City and had wanted to go to Dieudonné again because I knew it would be one of the only places I'd be able to work with fine watermarking. The watermark was in turn a way I could invert the sense of transparency. The image itself is a transparent line formed in the opaque layer of the paper. Sorry, you probably have a hard time seeing. I guess you can see those. This sequence occurs in the section about the hand and combines neuroscience with personal memoir. The text overlays images upon successive images. The upper left spread signals the beginning of the sequence, the upper right, by using the opaque paper on the left and translucent papers following. The first page has a text by Frank Wilson, neurologist and author of the book, The Hand, that concludes with this thought: brain is hand and hand is brain. The facing page shows a drawing mannequin with an overlay of a text that draws from my personal story of hand problems. When the page is turned, the mannequin overlays the skeletal hand and reveals below it a pantograph, a copying device. Another significant finding for me was the way I could control the paper colors, and simply with a page turn, the Japanese paper, seen first with the black paper behind it, takes on a completely different color when the page is turned and it overlays with the white of the preceding pages. Memory is not discrete. Memories build on one another. I wanted these pages to propel the reader to move back and forward in order to deepen their reading of this book. This sequence introduces the section on tools and highlights the 2 most prominent tools in the Encyclopédie, the hammer and the divider, both found in almost every one of the plates on the métier. The hammer, of course, is still very much with us. It is the irreducible force, an extension of hand and intention. Its duration dates to the beginning of human history. The divider, by contrast, shapes nothing directly. It is a tool for thinking and planning, and for that reason, it suffered the fate of an incredible array of information-gathering objects throughout history, always improved upon and always forgotten. A later sequence in the book looks at, in the tools section, tools and objects section, this sequence moves into a discussion of the impact of machine life on society. The upper left is a little meditation on form, counterform relationships and how volumes are designed, how baskets are designed around enclosing a volume. To the right of that is a little visual essay on the 6 simple machines originally discussed by Archimedes, and you can follow this around from the leftmost part of that page is the inclined plane, then there's the screw, the pulley, the wheel and axle on the white page, the lever at the bottom, and then the type in this case forms the wedge. Lower left is introduction of power to machines, human and animal power, and then the lower right is water and wind, which was a massive shift in the abilities of people to manufacture. There are occasionally multiple authors quoted on a single page, Because I wanted the clarity of the page, I chose not to have attributions or footnotes, but used a bibliography at the end of each section in the order they appear in that section, and referenced by the first line of that text. The right-hand page signals the end of one sequence and the beginning of another. It plays with the opacity of printing against the transparency of the paper, using ink to mask the paper, allowing fragments of letters to emerge in the pattern. The trick to the eye is that the page is printed entirely on the back side of the sheet that you're looking at. While nothing was printed on this side of the page, it was in fact this face of the page I intended. You turn the page and the image transforms entirely. This is made by printing a layer of the plate in gold first and then black over out of register. The facing page uses one of the Encyclopédie mantra, but now fragmented, this time to reflect that the reader is moving into the section on the senses, which places an emphasis on different forms of reading. This page was actually a great surprise. I hadn't realized to what degree the previous Encyclopédie mantra would light up through the filter of the sheet on the left. A similar effect occurred with this page. The black of the background and the silver gray of the different tools on the right-hand page are actually the same color. The black just appearing so because it is printed on the verso of the sheet and now seen through the filter of the paper. That's actually the silver on the right side of the sheet. This particular page had to go through the press 10 times, 10 separate times. And that was a process of about 4 or 5 days of printing. The number of voices on the page required a subtle typographic system that was understandable in spite of, or maybe because of, the changes in page design throughout the book. The system uses Walbaum, a serif type reminiscent of the type of the original Encyclopédie, for the pages of text by Diderot. Trade Gothic, a 20th century sans serif, is used for all of the more contemporary texts, including mine. While the texts have shape, they are not intended to evoke recognizable shapes, but to shape the spaces in and around and between the bodies of text, with the intention of activating the so-called negative parts of the page as components of the reading experience. Before each of the 3 sections of the book, I've written an introduction to that section with visual design that speaks to the characteristic qualities of that section. As an introduction to the section on the hand, the typography signature has the soft curves evocative of material shaped in the hand. Excuse me. This is the introduction to the section about tools and machines. Its sharp-edged configuration referencing materials as shaped by tools. And this is a section referencing different ways of reading and simultaneous disfluency and reading patterns. I have a little movie to show you, which will show you all 150 page spreads, as page spreads, but in less than 2 minutes. So you don't have to worry about being here too late. So here goes. I still haven't figured out the musical accompaniment to this. See, nothing to it. So I thought I'd add just a little bit of a coda, just a little over a month ago, I was invited to come to Shanghai to celebrate the 40th anniversary of designing books by a person who is arguably the premier designer of books in China, Lu Jingren. And Lu is a very special person. It was quite an amazing event, taking over the first 2 floors of the major art museum in Shanghai. 23 million people in Shanghai today. And I couldn't imagine in this country such an event taking place to honor book design. Even with 20 designers involved, we wouldn't have attributed that amount of real estate to books. And so it was really a humbling experience. His work is also spectacular. But of course, when you're in China, they try to kill you with food. And we were having yet another magnificent banquet lunch and of all sorts of dim sum and stuff. And these soup dumplings came out, and I don't know if people have had these soup dumplings, but you know, I was sitting there looking at them, and I was thinking these are just perfect things. You know, the wrapper is so perfect, and you have no idea what's inside, and the contents are so delicious and so unbelievably hot that you bite into these things and they're just a disaster, but it's a great surprising and exploding mess. And I thought, you know, if I could design something that good, I'd be really happy. But they did seem like little books to me, and it was really a great moment of food and books and comradeship. So that's my thing, and if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to answer some.
iPads. Yes. Yeah. So what's next? Does that how does that relate to books in any way? Because I love to read, and I love to read books, and I also like to use an iPad. So is there any connection or bridge or future, or is it? Is it heresy?
No, it's not heresy. I mean, there are a lot of books that don't need to be paper. There's a lot of wasted resource out there. And the book was supposed to be gone by now. In 1984, when the Mac was developed, everybody said, the end is coming. And
can you use so we can hear you?
In the 19th century, photography was introduced. And there were painters tearing out their hair saying, this is the end of painting. But in fact, what it did was it made painting more interesting. And I think the same thing has happened a lot with books. There's some great book production today. And, it's caused people to really think more inventively about the things that they make. I don't have any problem with people reading on an iPad. I mean, that's not a threat. If anything, I think, it's made the work of people like me more valuable. So I like that. But no, I think it's silly to think of technology as a threat. You just have to think differently about what you do.
Well, it's interesting that we have Amazon bookstores now. So they create this method of getting people to read electronically and then cause the closure of bookstores, but now Amazon is opening bookstores. So that maybe answers the way of getting to this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think technology is a threat. I think maybe Amazon is. There's a little bit of a no, and the reason is I just don't trust consolidation of content like that. I find that to be really scary. So, when they start messing around with, controlling the work that authors can publish, I think that becomes really. But anything that is so centralized like that tends not to be healthy in the end.